Alright you guys, let's do another recap on the subject of tonic herbalism. And what I want to share with you guys is the three primary categories of herbalism, or the cultures that propagated these herbal systems that I most gravitate towards, and are pretty much the three foundational herbal systems in the whole category of herbalism that we're going to really look at when it comes to extracting out the principles, the applications, and also the specific herbs which we want to implement into our lifestyle. So the first thing we have to look at is the traditional Chinese or the Taoist Chinese herbal system. We did an entire video on the life force principles that actually govern the system of herbalism that comes from China. And again, those principles are broken down into three things. That's Qi, that's Jing, and that's Shen. And I want to say something about the herbal systems, that every herbal system coming from a different region in the world actually has a different kind of focus on why they implement and use herbs the way they do, depending on the climatic region, depending on the environment, whether it comes from more of a dry landscape, whether it comes from a rainforest, a jungle. Different areas actually influence the reasoning for why they use herbs the way they do. So from the Chinese system, a lot of the methodology comes from empowering our immune system. It comes from a certain type of peak performance in the sense of actually getting our neurological system, our brain, our cognition on point. So things like memory, things like focus, being able to stay with it. That's a big theme when it comes to using Chinese herbs to calibrate your ability to focus and perform in whatever activity it may be. It also has a lot to do with sexual virility. The Chinese were very heavy into the belief that your seminal fluids, the fluids that are riding throughout your spinal column, your cerebral spinal fluids, had a lot to do with your longevity potential. It had a lot to do with your vigor and vitality and your ability to kind of power through in your life. And we know that based on hormone research. And we're going to do a whole section on hormones in later videos. So a lot of the herbs are addressing these kind of things. The top 5 herbs that I want to reference in the Chinese system are, off the top of my head, reishi mushroom, Ganoderma lucidum is actually my favorite herb in the world for a number of reasons. Then there's eucommia bark, then there is schizandra berry, then there's astragalus, there's ginseng, there's also Hoshu Wu, Polygonum multiflorum. You may have heard of Fo tea, that's actually Hoshu Wu. And we could go into the ins and outs of all these herbs. We'll save that for later videos. But I just want to share some of the top herbs in these systems. Then you can look at the Vedic system, the Ayurvedic herbal system that comes from India. And just a little note on that. You know, I grew up as a martial artist, so I was very deep into the philosophy and the lineage and the heritage of martial arts. And I got very much into Chinese arts. And I came to find out that actually Kung Fu, or Chinese martial arts, wushu, whatever you want to call it, is actually derived originally from India. That's where it all kind of started. And the Vedic system, similar to the Chinese system, is said to be over 5,000 years in recorded, documented history. It's probably much longer than that realistically, that these herbs and these practices have been cultivated, but it's recorded for about 5,000 years. And the Vedic system focuses a lot on unifying the different practices in our life. So the Chinese system has a lot to do with, obviously, herbal practice, herbal wisdom, but then also things like acupuncture, meridians, the actually increasing the energy gateways in our body to increase energetic circulation, not just blood or lymphatic circulation, which are byproducts of that, but actually our energy systems. You might have heard of chakras, for example, which comes more from the Indian system. They're really, what's interesting is that they have different names and different kind of frameworks for these ideas, but they're all specifically talking about really the same thing. So the Vedic system has a lot to do with unifying our diet, our physicality, our spiritual directive, and also specific herbs into that whole picture, into the mosaic of our life. And the top 5 herbs that come to me from the Vedic system are ashwagandha, which is known to be the Indian ginseng. There is also tribulus. There is also mucuna, which is one of my absolute favorite herbs in the world for a number of reasons. There is turmeric. We've all probably heard of turmeric in some form or fashion. One of the most traditional culinary root herbs in the whole Indian system. They use it basically in everything. Cooking with ghee. Ghee and turmeric, by the way, are probably the 2 most popular things that come out of the Vedic system. And then a Bacopa, let's say a Brahmi or purslane. You may have heard of the leaves of purslane being very rich in omega-3 fatty acids. Well, that whole plant is actually an Ayurvedic herb called Bacopa, which is a very powerful brain supplement or stimulant. So you might see Bacopa or Brahmi in certain like nootropic, cognitive enhancing supplement formulations. Good thing to know about. And then also I want to talk about the Amazonian herbal system. And this is really interesting to me because it doesn't actually factor in specifically the energy systems of the body and some of the spiritual aspects of life the same way that the Chinese and the Ayurvedic system do. It's more focused on actual environmental conditions that take place when you're in the Amazon rainforest. So if you really kind of put yourself into that framework of being in a rainforest, you start to think like, well, what kind of things would I actually come across in that circumstance, in that context? You'd be dealing with pathogens. You'd be dealing with microbes, with a lot of bacterial infections, fungal infections, candida growth, fungal growth, and parasites, right? Those are the most prevalent exterior organisms that you'd actually have to contend with. So what Amazonian herbalism deals with a lot is strictly the physiology of our body and how to actually increase immune function. So we're completely protected against the onslaught of outside organisms or pathogens, for example. The top herbs that come to me out of that system are Paudiarco, which is actually one of my favorite herbs. I have a fascination with Paudiarco. It's a type of bark that grows on a tree that's actually very elastic. It's actually very similar to Euphorbium from the Chinese system. Euphorbium is a bark that grows on a rubber tree, and when you peel the bark off, it's very elastic. There's a pliability to it, and you can stretch it out. What they found out about Euphorbium is that it's very good for our joint capsules, for our ligaments, for our musculature, for increasing flexibility and elasticity of our mobility, our joints basically, the hinges like our shoulders and our knees and our elbows and the tendons in our body. Paudiarco is very similar to that, but also what Paudiarco is it's very antifungal. It has very anti-candida, a very powerful anti-candida constituents in it. And then when you pair it with the next Amazonian herb, which is Uno de Gato, otherwise known as cat's claw, which is antibacterial in nature, when you do a Paudiarco cat's claw combination, then you start to create antimicrobe or pathogen formulation. That's kind of how we want to think about these herbs, is creating formulas that work synergistically together, right? So we got those two. Then we think of Chuchu Huasi, which is known for being very good for alleviating digestive infections, soothing the intestinal tract, the GI tract, and also for powering up the immune system. I'm also thinking of Ilex guayusae. Ilex guayusae, by the way, is the #1 caffeinated plant. It has the most caffeine of any plant in the world. And what's interesting to me about that is that it's balanced out by something called Ltheanine, right? Ltheanine is a compound, it's an amino acid that's used oftentimes for anti-anxiety, anti-stress, kind of balancing out a hyper-sympathetic nervous system when we're kind of like, just kind of blowing ourselves out. It's good for relaxing the system. So it's interesting that Ltheanine would actually be constituent combined in that guayusa matrix. It's very interesting to me. And I want to rant a little bit on guayusa. The reason most of us may have heard of Amazonian herbalism or Shipibo herbalism or even the Amazonian culture and even know that there's a culture in the Amazon that's an indigenous culture that's still there is because of a man named Richard Evans Schultes. And you may have remembered some of these old black and white videos from, I think it was the 60s, where Richard Evans Schultes was actually, he was an American that got fascinated. He's an ethnobotanist, I think, and he was fascinated about the guayusa plant and actually traveled to the Amazon to go seek it out. And he came across the Banisteriopsis caapi plant, which is combined with the chacruna leaves, which makes up something called ayahuasca. That's for another video and maybe a different course, but that's a fascinating idea about how the ayahuasca combination even came to being. It defies all logic, defies all rationale and reason, and all of our Newtonian kind of scientific materialism. It breaks all that out the door. And then I'm thinking of Chonka Piedra. That's the 5th herb on the Amazonian lineup. Chonka Piedra is known as the stone breaker. And I love it because I'm big into calcification, which we'll talk about later when we get into mineralogy. We get into osteoporosis and arthritic conditions and the crustacean formations that basically impregnate our tissues with a hardening effect. So when people go like, they start to turn into like a stone golem as the aging process ensues. Chonka Piedra is one of those herbs that helps to slightly break down calcium phosphate formations or crystalline formations in our tissues, most specifically in our kidneys. So kidney stones are actually calcium phosphate formations that actually grow and accumulate in our kidneys. And our kidneys are not able to filter it out appropriately. It gets stuck and causes that kidney stone pain. Chonka Piedra, the stone breaker, is very helpful for breaking that stuff up. Really good information to know about. So those are the 3 primary herbal systems that I most subscribe to. There's many others, but those are my favorite, and I think those really set the stage for everything you need to know about herbalism. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole even further, you can study North American herbalism, you can study even Korean herbalism, Japanese herbalism, Siberian herbalism, Egyptian herbalism. I mean, like every single culture that's ever graced this planet, I bet, has had their own intrinsic herbal categorization and their application and ways of going about it using plants in their natural environment. So that is the basics of tonic herbalism, and we're going to go more into future videos, especially the recipe sections, on how to use some of these amazing tonic herbs for optimum performance.